Now, that dance between buyer and seller is always a challenging one, but if you're a big company, a multinational with lots of resources, maybe lots of experience in this sector, well, it's a whole lot easier. The challenge becomes for medium-sized enterprises, smaller enterprises, even micro-enterprises who want to get in on the act. How do they do that? And so there are two solutions we're going to explore. The first one is through club deals or multi-buyer PPAs. These are platforms that are being set up many times by NGOs who are trying to aggregate demand in some way on a club basis. And that is you and I, and we can come together, we can share experience, and we can go to the market with a common approach. This has a number of potential benefits. First of all, we gain in scale, and so our bargaining power in the negotiation shoots up. Second, this potentially increases the level of flexibility that we have, exploring contractual structures that allow us to get away from the need from the seller to lock us in for a long period of time. Finally, there's a risk-sharing mechanism embedded in all this. Of course, there are some drawbacks. It takes time and energy to align the stars for lots of people sitting around the table. And ultimately, the influence of any single buyer is going to be less. There's also a more commercial spin on all of this, which is aggregation. Some intermediary stepping in between the buyer and the seller in order to pool those resources. So with that, Bruno, let's turn to you. You've worked many years in financial markets and credit. This is an issue that comes up in a range of markets. What is this crucial role of aggregation and how does it work?
So, we talked earlier about diversification, this idea that if you're exposed to one asset, you have more risk than if you're exposed to a portfolio of assets, because if they're not correlated, they're going to be moving out of sync, essentially. And so when one is up, the other one might be down, or one is down, more importantly, the other one might be up. And so as a portfolio level, you have less volatility. It's true in credit as well. So if I have credit risk on one obligor, I essentially have more risk than if I have exposure to a portfolio of obligors that on average have the same credit risk but are not entirely correlated. So this idea of diversification is again important for credit risk here as well. So to take a parallel with financial markets, if you look at large credit asset managers, they don't buy one bond. Typically they have a large portfolio across different obligors, also across sectors, across geographies, etc. So here it's a little bit the same idea. If I'm a seller, the credit risk to the buyer is very important. And as I mentioned earlier, it also impacts my ability as a seller, as a developer, owner of the asset, to finance this asset. Right. So now in a multi-buyer PPA, in a club deal, I have credit risk to a portfolio of credits essentially. And that's a lot more attractive because my risk of losing all of my PPAs at the same time is a lot less than the risk of losing the one PPA if I only have one. And therefore my ability to raise finance is also better. In terms of the aggregator, that's yet a slightly different structure, because really what the aggregator does, steps in, is the single counterparty, single buyer in the PPA facing the developer. So now as a developer I face the aggregator, which typically is a better credit risk. And then the aggregator itself is taking the credit risk of all the smaller buyers. So the aggregator really is a credit enhancement in many ways. It's taking the credit risk of all the buyers, and so it's getting compensated for taking that credit risk. Sometimes it also takes some smaller risk, more on the output of the asset. But really this idea of the aggregator is to be an intermediary that takes the credit risk, facilitates transactions, and is of course getting compensated in order to do that.
And of course there's a lot of discussion today about whether there's actually a public good somehow in that credit enhancement process. Multilateral banks, other institutions exploring whether they want to step in some way in order to raise the overall credit profile, either through some kind of aggregation mechanism or through guarantees directly to aggregators.
Absolutely. In some way the aggregator is, you can see it nearly as a guarantee, essentially, because if one of the buyers defaults, goes bankrupt, cannot pay under the PPA, it's really the aggregator's problem, it's not the developer's problem.